Why has Donald Trump decided to move closer to Russia? What truly motivates the President of the United States, and what compels him to make what seem like impossible concessions regarding Vladimir Putin? How did it happen that the leader of the world's most powerful nation is forced to consider the interests of a state that the West is trying to isolate with sanctions? Why does Russia, which many predicted would soon collapse, continue to play a key role on the world stage? And the most important question: how is it that a politician who managed to bring Israeli and Palestinian leaders to the same negotiating table finds himself unable to exert decisive pressure on Moscow and secure all the required concessions? In this analysis, we will try to find answers to these difficult questions. What does Russia want? To understand Donald Trump's motives, we need to examine recent history and how the West has perceived Russia over the past 30 years. This perception is perfectly illustrated by one key statement. Here's what the late Republican Senator John McCain declared. "Listen, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. It is a kleptocracy. In reality, this nation's economy depends solely on oil and gas." This phrase encapsulates all the contempt of the Western elite of that period. Russia was seen by them as an oil and gas appendage with a nuclear arsenal, but without real weight in global politics. Yes, everyone understood that Russian nuclear forces were capable of destroying the world. But in the context of conventional, hybrid wars and economic influence, Moscow was not considered a serious player capable of challenging. It was precisely this contempt that became the reason why the West ignored its own promises about not expanding NATO eastward. Why consider someone who, in their opinion, cannot respond? At the same time, the West was confident that Russia was too interested in trade and cooperation to dare to do anything. This confidence collapsed in 2022. It is important to consider that as far back as December 21st, in a meeting with Biden, Putin clearly outlined the red lines: no NATO membership for Ukraine. Mass leaks indicate that the West knew about the reality of the invasion. For example, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called Zelensky shortly before February 24th and, according to some reports, urged him to publicly renounce membership in the alliance, fearing war. Zelensky refused. By February 2022, Russia found itself in a trap. Further NATO expansion into Ukraine created unacceptable strategic threats for Moscow. It wasn't just about military bases. The key issue was ABM systems. The fact is, the flight trajectory of ballistic missiles from Russia to Europe passes through their apogee precisely over Ukrainian territory. This is the ideal place to intercept them. Placing ABM radars and launchers there would deprive Russia of the capability for a guaranteed retaliatory strike, the foundation of its nuclear doctrine. For the Kremlin, this is an existential threat to the state. It was this, and not abstract imperial ambitions, that became the main trigger for Moscow. Observing how Britain was negotiating the creation of military infrastructure in Ukraine, including a base in Ochakovo and the deployment of ABM elements, Russia decided that the cup of patience had overflowed. And so now, after 3 years of conflict, Trump is talking about peace. But why? After all, officially, Ukraine is not losing. However, the problem is that this is merely an appearance. The real situation on the front and in world politics is apparently forcing Washington to seek new paths. The numbers don't lie. But enough politics. Let us turn to the language of numbers, which, unlike propaganda, does not lie. Let's look at the real economic indicators of Russia and Ukraine, according to the International Monetary Fund. Before you is a table with data for 2021, the last peaceful year. It shows the starting positions of the two sides before the conflict. Russia's nominal GDP was $1.8 trillion. Ukraine's was $200 billion. The difference is ninefold. GDP based on purchasing power parity. Russia was $5.6 trillion. Ukraine was $746 billion. The difference is eightfold. Unemployment in Ukraine was almost twice as high. Inflation and national debt were also less favorable in Ukraine. The conclusion is obvious. Even before the war, Ukraine's economy was an order of magnitude weaker than Russia's. Now, let's see what happened over the years of the conflict. The data for 2024 forces us to state two key facts. Fact 1. Despite colossal Western aid, the economic situation in Ukraine continued to worsen. Russia's nominal GDP grew to $2.1 trillion. Ukraine's GDP fell to $190 billion. GDP by PPP, Russia demonstrates growth to almost $7 trillion. Ukraine shows a decline to $657 billion, still not returning to its pre-war level. Unemployment. In Russia, it reached a historical minimum. In Ukraine, it rose to 13.1%. Ukraine's budget deficit in 2024 exceeded 17%, a critically high indicator. Fact 2. The sanctions strike against Russia did not lead to the collapse of its economy. In all key macroeconomic indicators, the Russian Federation not only held firm, but also strengthened its position relative to Ukraine. So what about the forecast for 2025? Perhaps the Russian economy is now in ruins, as many Western analysts predicted? Let us turn again to the IMF forecast. No, the picture has only worsened. The forecast for 2025 more sharply highlights just how different the economic trajectories of the two countries involved in the same conflict have been. Russia's nominal GDP is projected to reach a record $2.5 trillion. This is 12 times more than Ukraine's. Moscow's PPP GDP will be 11 times larger. Russia's national debt will be only 23% of its GDP. That's 176th place in the world. For comparison, Ukraine holds 38th place. Budget deficit. In Russia, it is forecast at 3%. In Ukraine, at 18.5%. The conclusion is obvious. By all main indicators, Russia has not merely adapted to the sanctions, but is demonstrating stable growth. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian economy by 2025 has transitioned into a state of complete dependence on external assistance. Now, for the key indicator, foreign trade in gold and foreign exchange reserves. Here, we see the same picture. Over the years of the conflict, Ukraine has definitively shifted its foreign trade to reliance on borrowed funds. Russia, despite all restrictions, continues to show a trade surplus. And although gold and forex reserves contracted in 2024, the IMF forecasts that Moscow will return to their accumulation already in 2025. An important note, all the data in this table is as of August 2025. And if the trend for Russia is positive, then for Ukraine, judging by the dynamics, it is negative. Numbers do not lie. And these numbers are not from Russian propaganda. They were published by the International Monetary Fund, which is difficult to suspect of having sympathies for Moscow. In fact, we are looking at direct proof. The Western strategy of economically destroying Russia has failed. Moreover, calculations show that even in the event of a complete cessation of external financing sources, Russia could continue military operations for several more years using only its own reserves. What does all this lead to? To the fact that Donald Trump, unlike biased politicians and media, most likely understands this perfectly well. He sees that Ukraine's prospects are dim, while Russia's economy is resilient. And therefore, further protraction of the conflict plays into the hands not of the USA and the EU, but of Vladimir Putin. Consequently, it becomes a strategic task for Trump to stop this war as soon as possible, even at the cost of unpopular concessions. The irony is that, as of today, Washington simply has no strong cards to play to dictate its terms to Moscow. This is understood in the White House, but they are not ready to admit it publicly. And here we approach the main irony of the situation. The United States is likely frightened not so much by Ukraine's defeat, but by another, much larger scale threat. This is the complete loss of leverage over Russia and the final formation of a solid, strategic alliance between Moscow and Beijing. And it is this geopolitical perspective, not the sad forecasts for Kiev, that is what apparently truly worries the American president and forces him to seek paths to dialogue. Friends, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Main threat: China. The People's Republic of China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so. These words belong to Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor under the Biden administration. And it is this phrase that best describes what currently frightens the American elite, and Donald Trump in particular. Moscow's potential military power is no match for the capabilities of modern China. Not only does Beijing project its power globally, possessing several aircraft carrier groups, but it also wields colossal economic and political capital. Unlike Western nations, China rarely imposes political conditions on its partners, limiting itself to purely economic interests. This win-win strategy is beginning to pose a direct threat to the United States. After all, even some European Union countries are increasingly preferring Beijing over Washington in matters of trade and investment. As the authoritative American journal Foreign Affairs writes in an article dated November 24, 2025, titled "America's Self-Defeating China Strategy, Washington's Policy of Isolating Beijing is Backfiring." Direct quote. Despite the United States' efforts to isolate China, many global South countries have strengthened their ties with Beijing, which positions itself as a more attractive partner by offering economic opportunities without political conditions. This alone is deeply concerning to the US. Now add the war and sanctions against Russia to this. Moscow, under pressure, is forced to sell its resources at a discount, and neighboring countries, despite Western pressure, are willingly buying them, ignoring the opinions of both Brussels and Washington. It is the rapid growth of China's influence and its economic integration with the rest of the world that frightens American authorities far more than Kiev's territorial losses. While Russia loses resources in the conflict, China wins, strengthening its ties and watching as its main geopolitical rival is distracted by what, from Beijing's perspective, is a secondary front. Henry Kissinger, shortly before his death, provided an accurate diagnosis of the situation. Kissinger, quote, "We now face a situation where Russia could move away from Europe completely and seek a permanent alliance elsewhere. We must strive for a long-term peace." Kissinger thought in generational terms. He understood perfectly well that Russia, backed into a corner, would seek and find other allies. Trade between Beijing and Moscow, even if not perfectly advantageous for the latter, allows the Kremlin to confidently withstand the Western coalition. This has been an unpleasant surprise for Brussels and Washington. And it is this that compels Trump to find a way to prevent further rapprochement between Moscow and Beijing. After all, this alliance primarily strengthens China. In essence, Beijing has managed to turn the Kremlin into its strategic balancer, which diverts the attention and resources of the US and the EU. Trump and his inner circle understand this perfectly, and this frightens them much more than Ukraine's defeat. A durable Russia-China alliance is a strategic nightmare for Washington, and to prevent it, Trump is prepared to go far. His primary task now is, at a minimum, to achieve peace in Ukraine and ease sanctions to deprive China of access to cheap Russian resources. At a maximum, to initiate a rapprochement with Russia to offer the Kremlin an alternative in the form of the US as a major trading partner. The opinion of the European Union and Ukraine itself matters little to Trump when US global dominance is at stake. To reiterate, it is not Russia, but China, that has both the desire and the capability to destroy American primacy. It is not Russia, but China, that could end the dominance of the dollar. China is the main threat to the United States, and Donald Trump, it seems, is prepared to do much to pull Russia back into the orbit of Western influence and turn it to face the West.
Friends, if you liked our work, then please subscribe to this channel, and of course do not forget to leave your comment. Do you agree with our opinion?